Hello, and welcome to Exposed News Outlet. My name is Andrea, and I will be your host. I have a lot to discuss today about white privilege and lack of empathy, compassion, and even a soul or consciousness. As racist white nationalists that feel self-entitled always lash out when they even hear about reparations, despite the country literally owing them both morally and ethically, as well as the fact that slaves were the only humans discriminated against for the color of their skin, literally. Mostly all being Africans, whom were kidnapped, often by rival tribes. I have several other videos where I touch on the history and the stories about the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the history of white nationalism and the occult, etc. But before we get into the facts, if I could just ask that you please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and check the bell for all my latest updates and video content. I appreciate it. It really helps me out a lot, and it helps to get the truth out and the facts to people that might not otherwise see it. Also, help support independent, truth-driven journalism, empower a transgender voice in the fight for a democracy and civil rights. In today's world where misinformation spreads like wildfire and hate-fueled narratives dominate the headlines, independent voices that fight for truth are more important than ever. I'm a transgender journalist on a mission to provide quality, fact-based news that challenges the status quo and brings clarity to the stories that matter. As a member of the LGBTQ+ community, I understand firsthand the need for honest, inclusive, and empowering journalism that defends civil rights, equality, and freedom. But to make this vision a reality, I need your help. As an independent journalist, I'm building a media platform that cuts through the noise and provides real, unbiased coverage, especially on issues that affect marginalized communities, including transgender people and other marginalized groups. The equipment and software needed to produce high-quality content, ensure professional editing, and run a credible platform are costly, and every day I work toward making this a sustainable reality. Your donation will help me secure the essential tools required. For those who are able to help, I will link my GoFundMe link in the description box below, and once again, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for believing in independent journalism, and thank you for believing in my vision. Together, we can build a future where every voice is heard and where misinformation doesn't have the final say. So thank you. Without further ado, let's get into the video. White nationalists often deny the need for reparations and attempt to downplay the severity of the historical injustices committed against enslaved Africans and their descendants. Here are some reasons why. Number one, lack of empathy. White nationalists often fail to acknowledge the humanity and suffering of enslaved people and their descendants. Number two, fear of loss of privilege. Reparations would require a redistribution of resources and recognition of historical injustices, which would challenge the privilege and power that white people have historically held, and why they're trying so hard, even pushing disinformation to this day to try to keep. Number three, denial of responsibility. By pointing to other countries' involvement in slave trade, white nationalists attempt to deflect responsibility and shift the blame. Number four, minimization of harm. White nationalists often downplay the severity of the transatlantic slave trade and its ongoing impact of African Americans. Number five, racism and xenophobia. White nationalists often hold racist and xenophobic views, which lead them to deny the humanity and dignity of people of color. Watch this clip.
Republicans have introduced a bill under the guise of ending discrimination, which actively and very obviously discriminates. Classic MAGA logic. House Democrats were having none of it.
This bill, titled the Dismantling DEI Act, is an utter disgrace. Having sat and read the text in preparation for today's markup, I have yet another example to tell my constituents about the unserious work of the Republican Party. Now, I'll work with anyone serious about progress who wants to center the people who call this country home. This isn't it. The Committee on Oversight has the broadest jurisdiction in the entire House of Representatives to investigate any topic it chooses, but we are debating legislation that denies the sky is blue, water is wet, and racism is real. The major provision of the bill says to ban anything that acknowledges racism. And a few pages later in the exact same bill, there are multiple provisions discussing the presence of racism. This Republican approach is as predictable as it is nonsensical. On one hand, they're saying that racism does not exist. On the other hand, they are saying there is rampant reverse racism. Well, how do you reverse something that never existed in the first place? Riddle me that. While this Republican policy may have a new name, it's the same old tired game. Look, y'all are entitled to your opinions, but not a denial of the facts. Do you all know your history? Do you know American history? The original Constitution counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person. During World War II, the federal government forcibly relocated and incarcerated 110,000 Japanese Americans. The FHA practiced redlining in the 1930s and 60s to deny mortgages to Black Americans, which is why we have a racial wealth gap today. I could go on. The GI Bill, which is supposed to be race neutral, denied access to Black Americans, denying them equal access to education and housing benefits, which is why we do not have generational wealth. Don't talk to me about merit when those Black servicemen fought for our freedoms. And I'd also just like to take a personal note of privilege to say, please keep Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s name out of your mouths. Yes. Your perversion of his words and his mission when his children have asked you to stop invoking his name and perverting his work when he was a proud and unapologetic Black man fighting for equality for Black Americans and all marginalized people. So you all are entitled to your opinions, but not a denial of the facts. But I'm not surprised that you would deny American history. What I am, though, is committed. Committed to speaking truth to power, committed to standing up for marginalized communities and vulnerable people, committed to ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity to buy a house, to work a job, to pursue higher education, and to live in a society that is fair and just. A colleague across the aisle invoked the phrase of, we must do everything to stop government-sponsored oppression. Well, I've just enumerated numerous examples, which is exactly why we have legislation and an executive order to reverse this harm. And that is why I'm committed to opposing this bill and urge my colleagues to do the same.
I appreciate my Democrat colleague for exemplifying exactly the kind of oppression of freedoms that we're referencing. How about we'll quote whoever we want to quote? How about that's my First Amendment right? That's exactly the kind of baked-in oppression. Like, how dare a white Republican quote Martin Luther King? We actually had a congressman say that just now in this committee. Well, thank you, good lady, for once again exemplifying the type of oppression that we stand against. You know I'm right. You know I'm right.
Order. Mr. Higgins has the floor.
And we will quote who we please to quote.
A disgrace.
And we will continue to speak freely because I'm a veteran. That's the country that I serve. That's the Constitution I swore allegiance to. And that oath has no expiration date. I will fight for it with my last life's blood. For my right to speak freely and yours, good lady. You will never hear me saying, how dare you quote anybody you please to quote. And that exemplifies, America, precisely the type of institutional oppression that my colleague, Mr. Cloud's bill, for which I'm an original co-sponsor, hopes to push back against.
But Mr. Higgins, have you read your own bill? Have you read your own bill? Because it is trying to regulate speech.
Clay Higgins really is the poster child for the sorts of people who talk about reverse racism.
You consistently said over and over the word oppression, and every time that you said it, it was almost as if I was hearing nails on a chalkboard, because it seems like you don't understand the definition of oppression, and I'd ask you to just refer to Google to help you out. Oppression is the prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control. That is the definition of oppression. And so as I sit here as a black woman who practiced civil rights, let me tell you the reason that my colleagues wanted to make sure you understood the same black history that your side of the aisle wants to delete out of classrooms is because you can then misuse words like oppression. There has been no oppression for the white man in this country. You tell me which white men were dragged out of their homes. You tell me which one of them got dragged all the way across an ocean and told that you are going to go and work. We are going to steal your wives. We are going to rape your wives. That didn't happen. That is oppression. We didn't ask to be here. We're not the same migrants that y'all constantly come up against. We didn't run away from home. We were stolen. So yeah, we are going to sit here and be offended when you want to sit here and act like, and don't let it escape you that it is white men on this side of the aisle telling us, people of color on this side of the aisle, that y'all are the ones being oppressed, that y'all are the ones that are being harmed. That's not the definition of oppression. You tell me the prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment that you've had, and we can have a conversation.
You could start with Exodus.
The final thing that I will say on this particular issue, two things. There is an article from The Guardian, and it is a little old. It's from 2021, so I apologize. But it said that back then, just 3 years ago, white men represent 30% of the population, but 62% of office holders. These are the issues that we are constantly looking at and recognizing and trying to say, is this just? I can't even tell you how many white men have served in this chamber, but I can tell you that I am only the 55th black woman to be elected to Congress. And so when you want to talk about history and pretend as if it was so long ago, it wasn't. Because again, I am just number 55. Finally, when we start to talk about what do these numbers do as we're trying to say the diversity, equity, and inclusion is the problem, the reality is that when it comes to financial performance, companies with more diverse workforces are more likely to outperform their competitors. Companies in the top quartile for racial diversity are 35% more likely to outperform their peers on profitability. Companies with diverse executive teams are 25% more likely to generate greater profits. Diverse companies earn 2.5 times higher cash flow per employee. Diversity works. And until you can show me data that says otherwise, I think that we need to go back to being a country that listens to experts and gets out of our feelings and recognizes, again, that racism is real in this country. And until we stop pretending that it's not, we will not solve the problems that we are consistently facing. And that will bring real unity that we seek when we're looking for a more perfect union.
I really have a question for the sponsor. So I've been sitting and listening and trying to hear your intent and talking about discrimination. But the problem is that argument falls apart on page 6, line 17 through line 20. And in fact, if you're sincere about your intent of the bill, what I would tell you is you should delete those lines. Because actually those lines are actual new discrimination. See, you want to get rid of an office. We may disagree with it, but you can get rid of an office. You want to change policy. We may disagree with the policy you want to change, but here actually in those lines, you are creating second-class federal employees. You're creating new discrimination. May not transfer, discrimination. May not reassign, discrimination. May not redesignate any employee, discrimination. Those are protections that every other federal employee in every other office in the federal government gets. It's a right and a privilege that they get. But you're going to remove that from these people, not an office. Fine, I disagree with it, but it's an office. Not a policy. Fine, we disagree with it, it's a policy. This is people now. Now you're going to the people. You're saying, because you worked in an office that we don't think should exist, because you worked there, we're going to remove protections that every other federal employee gets, but not you, because we disagree with the office you worked in. That is straight up discrimination. And so listen, if you're serious about wanting to change the office and the policy, you should remove those lines, because the entire argument falls apart.
The irony of MAGA Republicans crying discrimination is truly unbelievable. The free speech that Clay Higgins talks about allows white people to say the N-word, but prevents schools from teaching Black history. It allows people to proudly fly the Confederate flag, but doesn't allow kids to read books about or by queer people. They rely on discrimination to ensure that white supremacy and heteronormativity aren't threatened by diverse opinions and perspectives. Clay Higgins exemplifies exactly what MAGA stands for. If we have any chance of getting through the next 4 years, we must realize its historical context, stand in solidarity, and fight alongside the people who stand to lose the most in this dark period.
It's essential to recognize that, number one, reparations are not just about money. Reparations are about acknowledging the historical injustices committed against enslaved people and their descendants, and working towards healing and reconciliation. Number two, the transatlantic slave trade was a unique evil. While other countries were involved in the slave trade of the transatlantic, which was perpetrated primarily by European colonizers and Americans, were unparalleled. Number three, African Americans continue to face systemic racism. The legacy of slavery and racism continues to impact African Americans today, with ongoing disparities in education, housing, healthcare, and economic opportunities, much of which I will even go further and say are because of these indoctrinations and whitewashing of history and denial of the facts, as they constantly deny to teach the facts and reality. And so a lot of these people have these misconceptions and it's not even reality. Watch this clip.
250 years of slavery, decades of Jim Crow, housing discrimination, and other forms of systemic racism. All of that has led to this: a shocking wealth gap between black and white households in the United States. An average gap of $850,000 that, some experts believe, can be solved by something long overdue: reparations to the descendants of enslaved black people. But how do we even determine who's eligible for reparations? And can the struggle for reparations in other parts of the world teach us anything about what needs to be done in the US? To understand why there's a call for reparations, there needs to be an understanding of the scale of slavery. It was a crime against humanity in which around 400,000 people were forcibly brought to North America. Over the centuries, 10 million enslaved people were legally treated as property in the United States, brutalized and ruthlessly exploited for free labor, which was used to establish the country as a leading global economy. In fact, one historian estimated that by 1860, enslaved people were, quote, worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire US economy. That's around $115 billion today. When slavery was abolished in 1865, 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans were freed, but through their forced labor, they'd created billions of dollars in generational wealth for their captors and none for themselves. Back then, the US government understood the need for reparations and passed an order to distribute 40 acres and a mule to all formerly enslaved families so they could build wealth and financial security. However, after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, President Andrew Johnson vetoed the allocation and returned the land to former slave owners. One way to reckon with America's past and current wealth disparity is through reparations that close the racial wealth gap.
You should make direct monetary payments to the eligible recipients.
That's economist William Darity. He co-authored the book From Here to Equality, which outlines one of the most comprehensive plans for what material reparations could look like.
So we estimate that this would require an expenditure of approximately $350,000 per eligible recipient. You get a figure of approximately $14 trillion.
Reparations for the crime of slavery and its legacy have long been a subject of national debate.
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago for whom none of us currently living are responsible is a good idea.
And I think they're using what academics would call the theory of distance, that something is too far in the past to have contemporary application.
So it's easy to see why Congress has yet to pass H.R. 40, a bill that was proposed all the way back in 1989. It would set up a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery and its subsequent racial and economic discrimination against African Americans. And while you cannot place a monetary value on slavery and its lasting effects, there's a precedent of reparations programs compensating victimized communities directly. Back in the US, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 designated $20,000 payments to Japanese Americans who survived internment camps during World War II.
The U.S. government has also made payments in instances where it was not the culpable party. Payments made to families that lost loved ones during the course of the 9/11 attacks, as well as payments that are being made to individuals who were held hostage in Iran at the end of the Carter presidency.
Up to $4.4 million per hostage or their estates. In the case of slavery, the US government did promise reparations. It's just reneged on it. In fact, when the US finally issued an apology for slavery, it included the disclaimer, "Nothing in this resolution authorizes or supports any claim against the United States or serves as a settlement of any claim against the United States." Nor did the US ever provide true reparations, a process consisting of three things: acknowledgement, redress, and closure for grievous injustices.
It's vital that the federal government issue an apology because that will create the justification for the redress plan that follows.
That brings us to who would actually receive reparations. Those direct payments would go to the roughly 47 million Americans who identify as Black. But under Darity's plan, the requirements are a little more strict. First, Black Americans would have to have identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before any reparations plan goes into effect. And they'd have to prove that they had at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. One way to do that is using the census. If your ancestor was present in the 1870 census and was old enough to have been alive in 1850 or 1860, but you can't find that person in the 1850 or 1860 census,
that would suggest that they were probably enslaved.
That's because before slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, enslaved people were not counted in the census.
They're actually missing people from the 1850 and 1860 census, and their absence there is a potential indicator that they were probably enslaved.
But while Darity's plan has received traction, it still faces opposition.
The impression down here is that Caribbean people who live in the United States, Black people, would not be entitled to any reparation paid by the US government. But we are saying that's not right. We are saying that's divisive of the Black population in the United States. We are saying that Caribbean immigrants have been harmed by that system through racial profiling, discrimination.
See, the Black population in the US is pretty diverse. Most Black people are foundational Black Americans, meaning they're American descendants of enslaved people. Others are immigrants or the children of immigrants who came to the United States from mostly African and Caribbean countries. Those individuals may have ancestors who were enslaved, but wouldn't be considered eligible recipients for reparations in the United States.
Descendants of the enslaved have a claim that's linked directly to the failure to provide their ancestors with the promised 40-acre land grants. And that's uniquely a debt that is owed to the individuals who were enslaved and it was not met, and to their descendants. The second reason that's somewhat related is the fact that the current or existing racial wealth gap in the United States is a consequence of policies that have been pursued by the federal government that built white wealth to the detriment of black wealth.
A major policy Darity is referring to is the Homestead Act of 1862, or H.R. 125, legislation to, quote, secure homesteads to actual settlers of public domain. The policy incentivized citizens to move onto and settle land that had been violently stolen from indigenous nations. It provided 160-acre land grants to over 1 million white families for a small fee, but excluded the 4 million formerly enslaved people from the program who had already been denied the 40-acre land grants they'd been promised. Through the act, 270 million acres of land was settled across 30 states over 124 years. Remember, owning land generates income, and passing land down to the next generation builds wealth. So the consequences of that decision are seen today. Approximately 45 million living white Americans have benefited from this massive asset-building legislation.
I would argue that virtually all black people throughout the diaspora, the African diaspora, have a claim for reparations, but they don't all have a claim for reparations from the United States government.
The horrors of slavery and its consequences are not uniquely American. The transatlantic slave trade transported approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans across the Americas. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans were shipped directly to Latin America and the Caribbean. Spain and Britain shipped around 1 million enslaved Africans just to Jamaica. By 1833, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. But instead of compensating formerly enslaved people, Britain provided reasonable compensation to slave owners through a then £20 million loan, which British taxpayers fully repaid in 2015. According to one estimate, that's worth over 20 billion British pounds today. For decades, descendants of enslaved people have been fighting for reparations in these regions, and in 2013, several Caribbean countries united to form the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which developed a strategy for reparations that focuses on reparatory justice.
The 10-point plan begins with the demand for an apology,
which is followed by calls for repatriation, an Indigenous Peoples Development Program, eradicating illiteracy, and debt cancellation, to name a few. CARICOM has sent letters requesting reparations from countries like Spain, France, Britain, and the Netherlands.
The response was negative for the most part. No country admitted to the wrong, no country took responsibility, no country apologized, no country committed to repair.
Today, we're still living with the legacies of colonialism and enslavement that have left black populations across the globe at a disadvantage.
There is definitely a case that can be made that there has been a global pattern of exploitation of people of African descent.
We're here to demand what's owed to us from the United States government.
And despite incremental progress and different approaches to reparations programs, people across the Americas continue to fight for redress.
Right now, this is a contentious issue. It's affecting relationships, world relationships, global relationships, country versus country disputes exist. I think reparatory justice would help the society to heal itself. Both people of African descent, African people, and European people. I think it will be good and beneficial to all of us.
By acknowledging the historical and injustices committed against enslaved people and their descendants, we can work towards a more equitable and just society. What's more is that white nationalists often think of themselves as the Israelites, even though they were literally of African descent, certainly not white, as all the people in the Bible in the original sources of the Bible. I won't even get into on this video, but if you look into the Sumerian tablets, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, read Compendium of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. It's an amazing book. It goes into a deeper dive of the Emerald Tablets, and it shows them side by side in comparisons. And it's very important to know this. Knowledge is power. Don't ever forget that. The people in the Bible, are from an African descent and Middle Eastern, which, even in ancient times was part of Africa. It was Kemet. Certainly not white. I can assure you that. However, you have them tell it, and it's a much different story where they're always the victims. They're the perpetrators playing the victim. Watch this.
Policing white supremacy, the enemy within. Both those phrases could be subject to some ambiguity. Why this title?
My co-author, Beth Zasloff, was something very simple and explained what the book is really trying to do. So policing white supremacy is about how law enforcement is ineffective in the way it addresses white supremacist and far-right militant violence, with instruction on how they can improve that performance, and more importantly, to recognize that it isn't just a law enforcement issue. This is something that giving law enforcement more powers isn't going to solve. In fact, that's part of the problem. And the enemy within was intentionally ambiguous, both because it somewhat references the idea that the way that law enforcement looks at white supremacist activity as a domestic issue when it's really international. There are white supremacists all over the world. These groups that engage in violence often network internationally. So this distinction, calling them domestic terrorists versus international terrorists, is part of the discrepancy in the way law enforcement addresses terrorism in the United States. But also the other ambiguous part is that a lot of the book focuses on affinity for these groups within law enforcement. So it's not just that these groups are outside law enforcement and need to be addressed by law enforcement, but that this is a problem that has festered within law enforcement since the beginning of history in this country.
Well, and many of our, certainly in the South in particular, many of the police departments started out as slave patrols, and as did, Patrick Henry gave a big speech about this at the ratifying convention for the Constitution, that without what became the Second Amendment, without something that explicitly authorized states to have militias and arm those militias, and he was specifically referring to the Virginia Slave Patrol. He was the largest owner of slaves in the state. That he wouldn't vote for the Constitution. So arguably even the state militias, what we call the National Guard, started out as the slave patrols. So white supremacy and its involvement with police, it goes way back, not just to the 1870s when the Justice Department came out of the effort to push back against the Klan and the fight against Reconstruction, if I've got that right.
Absolutely, and it's easy to look at that as a remnant of history, but it persists. And after the Reconstruction period ended and Jim Crow laws were put in place and black codes all across the United States, it's often easy to assume this is a southern U.S. problem, but fugitive slave patrols went all across the nation. And during Jim Crow, there were also black codes in Midwestern states and northern states. Vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan were powerful in Southern California. So this has never been just a regional problem. It's always been within the entire country in the way that our society creates racial hierarchies, and the police are the ones who enforce those hierarchies. The towns where a person of color is met on one side of the town by a police officer who takes them to the other side of the town and says, don't be here past sundown. These laws and policies were always enforced by police.
So part of this has to do with how we define, in the modern context, how we define terrorism. This is the word du jour since 9/11, and or the word decade or whatever.
Right.
And here we've got this guy who blew himself up in front of the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas, left behind 2 manifestos. One of them said, fellow service members, veterans, and Americans, it's time to wake up. Americans only pay attention to spectacles and violence. What better way to get my point across than with fireworks and explosives? Rally around Trump, Musk, Kennedy, and ride this wave to the highest hegemony for all Americans. He says, Americans must wake up, purge the government and military. Military and vets must move on D.C. Militias facilitate and augment this activity until the purge is complete. He said, try peaceful means first, but prepare to fight to get the Dems out of the federal government and military by any means necessary. They all must go, and a hard reset must occur for our country to avoid collapse. If he was speaking not of Republican Democratic politics, but instead on behalf of Islam, and he had brown skin, he would have been labeled a terrorist instantly. And instead, I have not heard one single news report refer to this guy as a terrorist. What's going on with this?
That's right. The way that not just law enforcement, but the media talk about terrorism is highly politicized, and that's really part of the problem. As you said, it comes definitionally, this concept of terrorism is a highly politicized term, where it's applied not based on the type of conduct, but rather based on whether the government has a concern about that political cause or social movement, which is why you see the law enforcement response to activism that is meant to drive social change, particularly when it's led by people of color in this country, receive a tremendous amount of law enforcement attention, whereas white supremacist violence isn't even tallied. Yeah. For years, we've been, and in fact, Congress passed a law requiring the FBI to document the number of domestic terrorism incidents, including breaking it down by white supremacists and the fatalities resulting thereof. And the FBI, as you said, for 25 years now, we've considered terrorism our number one priority, counterterrorism our number one priority, but they say that they don't collect domestic terrorism incident data. They don't know how many people white supremacists killed this year, or last year, or any other year.
I want to get to your experience being undercover with these people, but it seems to me that it's not just race, that it's almost a caste system, certainly a class system. I mean, you've got obviously, race a big factor in this one. Dylan Roof killing a half a dozen people, black people in a church, and the police drive him to a Burger King because he says he's hungry, he hasn't had lunch, on the way to jail. And then you contrast that with, Luigi, who shot a white multimillionaire CEO, and they march him to jail with a phalanx. I mean, with a military escort virtually, as if he was Osama bin Laden. The contrast is frankly shocking. And they never prosecuted Dylan Roof as a terrorist, as I recall. I think he was just prosecuted for murder, whereas Luigi is being prosecuted for terrorism as well. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me there's a differentiation in how the FBI and the Justice Department address white supremacist violence. And part of that comes from the history. One of the frustrations I've had over the last several years is a very widespread concept or idea by people who have previously been federal prosecutors who argue there is no domestic terrorism law. That's false, absolutely false. You can open the U.S. Code. There's an entire chapter called terrorism that defines both international and domestic terrorism simply by geography. Terrorism that occurs in the United States is domestic. Terrorism that occurs outside the United States is international. But they create these domestic terrorism categories by ideology. And then because they're not collecting data about who are the most persistent threats and who are the most serious threats, i.e. killing people, they're able to pick and which groups to prioritize. And they tend to prioritize groups that are engaged in less activity and less serious violence.
White nationalists often refer to the biblical book of Exodus as justification for their ideology, particularly in relation to their perceived notion of white genocide, or the idea that white people are being replaced by non-white people, hence their whole immigration xenophobia and everything else. Here are some possible reasons why they might refer to Exodus. Trust and believe, I had to look this up. Historical context and symbolism. Number one, chosen people narrative. White nationalists often identify themselves in some delusional way as the chosen people, mirroring the Israelites' narrative in the Exodus. They believe they are destined for greatness and that their survival is crucial. Number two, persecution complex. Exodus tells the story of the Israelites' persecution in Egypt. White nationalists often compare themselves to the Israelites, claiming they are being persecuted by minority groups, immigrants, or other perceived enemies. Number three, promise of a homeland. Exodus describes Israelites' journey to the Promised Land. White nationalists often use this narrative to justify their desire for a white-only homeland, or ethno-state. Misinterpretation and manipulation. Number one, selective interpretation. White nationalists cherry-pick verses and interpretations that support their ideology, ignoring or distorting the broader context and message of Exodus. Number two, manipulation of biblical themes. They manipulate biblical themes such as the idea of a chosen people or the promise of a homeland to justify their racist and exclusionary beliefs. Number three, pseudo-theological justification. By invoking Exodus, white nationalists attempt to provide a pseudo-theological justification for their ideology, making it seem more legitimate or morally justifiable. Critique and counter narrative. Number one, distortion of biblical message. Exodus is a story about liberation, freedom, and the struggle against oppression. White nationalists distort this message by using it to justify their own oppressive and discriminatory beliefs. Number two, ignoring the biblical emphasis on justice and compassion. The Bible, including Exodus, emphasizes the importance of justice, compassion, and caring for the marginalized. White nationalists ignore or downplay these themes in favor of their own exclusionary ideology. Number three, counter-narrative of inclusivity and love. A more accurate interpretation of Exodus and a broader biblical narrative emphasizes the importance of inclusivity, love, and compassion. This counter-narrative can help to challenge and dismantle white nationalist ideologies. Hopefully you've learned something new from this video that you didn't already know. Also, if you could please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and hit the like button if you haven't done that. It really helps me out a lot, and it will help me to get my video out into the algorithms. So thank you, I appreciate it. For those who are able to, I'll link the GoFundMe below. And we're better when we're united, when we come together, when we respect one another's differences and beliefs, and not try to shove hypocrisy, because they're claiming that the others are shoving their beliefs down their throats, and in return they're deflecting. They're really doing what they're accusing the others. It's just a circle jerk. Anyway, if you could please drop some comments, let me know what you think about the video and the current state of affairs. Thank you once again, and be kind to yourselves and be kind to others.